to force the bus companies to integrate. And of course, from that point, he focused mostly on basic civil constitutional rights, the right to vote. But in 1966, when he went to Chicago, he began to take this issue of poverty and economic justice more seriously. If you recall, when he went to Chicago in January of 1966, he went there to fight slum conditions and also to force real estate agents to cease their practices of discrimination. Discrimination in real estate practices. He's very concerned about that. So that was actually the beginnings of his serious war on poverty in Chicago in 1966. Running up against the Daley machine, Mayor Richard J. Daley, and the power structure in Chicago, he was fighting for the education of slum dwellers, for the organization of slum dwellers, also for what? The beginnings of a kind of poor people's campaign. A lot of people associate that with Memphis and the poor people's campaign as it was planned by SCLC later in 1967, but it actually began in 1966. And after 1966, 1967, Dr. King and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began to plan a poor people's campaign because they realized that even if people had access to hotels and other accommodations, if you don't have the economic resources, what good is it?
You know, Dr. Baldwin, that became important because when we moved from the rural South, picking cotton, sawmills, and et cetera.
That's right.
Going north, it was a belief that things would get better for Africans.
That's right.
But nevertheless, once we arrived in the north, we found that the so-called ghetto, you see, which is to say that we were separated in the South. But we were not separated in the South as we were separated in the North. And so poverty.
And the economic deprivation of people was in many cases more intense in the North.
Very good.
And Dr. King realized that when he went to Chicago to become a part of the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966. So it begins there, and in 1967, he and SCLC began to plan the first large-scale demonstration of the civil rights era, which was the Poor People's Campaign. It spilled over from 1967 into 68. And in the course of that movement, he got involved in the Memphis sanitation strike, if you recall, fighting for sanitation workers. There were a lot of people in SCLC didn't think that he should go to Memphis. But he went there because he felt that the sanitation strike was really an extension of what he was about in terms of the planning of this Poor People's Campaign. So he was all about poverty and economic injustice, a radical redistribution of economic resources. He was concerned about health care, about education for slum dwellers, and also about getting rid of what he called this syndrome of deprivation, which is associated with slum life and economic insecurity. So Dr. King made economic justice, poverty, a part of that last crusade of the civil rights movement. That's what he was about, aside from this question of international peace. But he was very concerned about economic justice, bringing about economic justice.
Public accommodation meant absolutely nothing if you did not have the opportunity to go to the restaurant.
Exactly. Public accommodations, public access meant nothing. If you don't have the money to rent a room in a hotel, if you don't have the money to eat at a restaurant, what good is access to public accommodation?
And it was always assumed that once Africans left the rural South and went to